Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone participating and watching today. Thank you for joining us to launch the ITF's flagship publication, the Transport Outlook 2021. During this session, we will hear about the key takeaways from the Outlook, and there will then be targeted sessions for each of urban and non-urban passenger transport and freight transport to follow this one over the course of the morning. Over the course of these sessions, we will hear from chapter authors, ITF modelers, and invited guest speakers. In this first session, the Outlook's project manager, Malithi Fernando, will present top findings of the report. And we will then be joined by ITF's lead modeler, Luis Martinez, for a Q&A session. Throughout this session, I invite those of you participating through the conference platform to please use the Q&A function that you can see on your screen to submit any questions that you would like our participants to discuss. There is also a discussion box for you to chat with others in the session. However, I would ask you to please note, excuse me, that this box will not be monitored by ITF staff. So I would encourage you again to please use that Q&A function for any question you want us to address. Finally, should you experience any technical difficulties, there is a live support button that you can see in the top right-hand corner of your screen. Please do use that to communicate with the technical staff behind the scenes. And with that, I will now hand over to Jari Kappala, the head of our quantitative policy analysis team, to get proceedings underway. Jari.
Thank you, Orla. And good morning, everyone from Paris. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all to this full day dedicated to the ITF Transport Outlook 2021. We will have presentations and panel discussions around the key findings from this Outlook released just yesterday. ITF Transport Outlook presents long-term projections for transport demand and related CO2 emissions under alternative policy scenarios. These scenarios are based on our in-house models covering all modes of transport, freight and passenger, both globally, nationally, and even at the levels of every city in the world. For us at the ITF, the Outlook is a strategic tool. It helps us to analyze how the world could change if we choose different policies and different development paths. Now, today, more than ever, there really is a need for such analysis. The COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically affected our daily lives and challenged the way we work, travel, and live. At the same time, the pandemic has highlighted the critical role the transport sector plays to ensure functioning of our society. Now recovery has started, but how the pandemic will change the mobility of people and the transport of goods over the longer term is still very much uncertain. This edition of the Outlook has a specific focus on the impacts of COVID-19 on transport, providing answers exactly to that question. But we must not lose sight of our vision for transport's future, economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable transport. As our results show, current decarbonization policies are not ambitious enough to meet climate goals set in the Paris Agreement. However, more ambitious decarbonization policies together with well-targeted economic stimulus packages would bring the climate goals of the Paris Agreement within reach faster and with more certainty. So there is an opportunity to reshape the transport sector by aligning policies to revive the economy, combat climate change, and strengthen social cohesion of our societies, as shown by the new edition of Transport Outlook. The policy scenarios presented in this report are designed to explore possible futures based on a number of assumptions. And given the uncertainties and complexities of these assumptions, these scenarios should not be seen as forecasts for the next 30 years. For us, they are rather simulations to understand what role public policy can play in designing the future transport system. So we consider Outlook as a discussion starter. But at the same time, today, it is also a call for action. It is call for action to reshape mobility in the wake of COVID-19. It is now my great pleasure to give the floor to my colleague, Maliti Fernando, who has managed the preparations of this year's edition of the Outlook. She will be giving an overview of the key findings of the new Transport Outlook 2021, but I also hope you will enjoy the rest of the session and the whole Outlook Day with our Outlook authors and invited guests in panel debates. And also, I hope you will participate actively in the debate through the question and answer function. Thank you very much, and Malithi, over to you.
Apologies there. Thank you, Jari. Hi, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Malithi Fernando, and I had the pleasure of managing the 2021 edition of the Transport Outlook. My presentation today is a bird's eye view. It gives an overview of the entire transport sector and our main findings, and draws from the first and second chapters of the report. So you can take a look there if you'd like more details. We'll start off with a quick summary of the 3 policy scenarios that we model in this publication. They represent 3 different levels of ambition when it comes to decarbonizing transport. The first, recover, looks at a return to our current policy trajectory. It tracks where we would be in a few decades if governments follow through on all implemented and announced policies from before the pandemic. Apart from that, we essentially return to pre-pandemic life. Reshape offers a completely different trajectory. The commitments coming out of the pandemic are transformational, and there's a focus on green recovery that goes far beyond original commitments. Reshape Plus, we identify where travel behavior and economic stimulus could be leveraged to boost policies in Reshape after the pandemic. It front loads the implementation of these policies during the recovery period. Now, what I mean by leveraging travel behavior is encouraging trends seen during the pandemic, such as increased walking and cycling or teleconferencing instead of business travel. First off, we'll take a look at where the transport sector is headed in terms of demand for travel and the resulting emissions. These are the results of our recover scenario. And after that, we'll spend some time looking at policy recommendations. Starting off with demand, under our current level of policy ambition, we expect the demand for passenger travel and the movement of goods to more than double between 2015 and 2050. The dip in 2020 is temporary, and we're already seeing pre-pandemic levels of traffic in some areas. Much of this growth is due to growth in passenger travel and freight demand is driven by population growth and increasing prosperity around the world. This is compounded to a certain extent because the regions experiencing the highest levels of population growth are also the regions of rapid economic growth. What does this mean for greenhouse gas emissions? Well, measured as the equivalent CO2 emissions, we estimate that the transport sector will see a 16% growth in emissions by 2050. This would overshoot the level needed to have a chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees by about 3 times. Of course, when looking at global warming, the total emissions are what matters. But when it comes to identifying where responsibility may lie in generating these emissions and now leading the charge to decarbonize the sector, we see a strong correlation between the world regions that generate the highest GDP per capita and where individuals emit the most transport emissions. The good news is that these are also the world regions with the capital and the technological means to take a leading role in reducing emissions. Now, how do we move from this fairly grim picture of where we are headed to what is possible with strong commitments and, more importantly, action? How do you create a transport system that's more sustainable and more equitable? Well, we have 6 insights for policymakers to reshape their transport systems in this very unique time in history. First off, we need to raise ambition to reverse CO2 emission growth. This graph shows clearly, with the dark blue line there, that if we stick to our current efforts, it is not enough to hit the CO2 reductions needed by 2030 and 2050, which would be compatible with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. As countries are revising their commitments this year to the Paris Agreement, there is a chance to do things differently. Under a reshape type policy scenario, we have a chance of just about meeting these carbon targets. But reshape plus, shown here in the green line, which seeks to front load and further leverage opportunities during recovery from the pandemic, it offers a chance to meet these objectives sooner and with more certainty. It achieves a 70% reduction in emissions by 2050. These environmental ambitions need to be aligned with COVID-19 recovery policies to ensure that the economy recovers and policies to create more equitable systems than before. Focusing on one at the expense of another will essentially mean 1 step forward and 2 steps back. Now, why do we need to do this? Well, let's take a look at the status quo. Within countries, inequality is growing. These are the kinds of inequalities people see day to day and experience. The causes and consequences of climate change are also unequally distributed. Wealthier countries and individuals have had a historically higher carbon footprint, while the people suffering the consequences of climate change are very low emitters. Inequalities extend to transport access as well. It has a huge impact on people's well-being. Those that are well off have higher transport access and therefore access to greater opportunities in life, while vulnerable groups in both developing and developed regions may be limited in the types of jobs that they can access. They may not be able to get to healthy food or healthcare. They may experience isolation, all because of these poor transport systems. COVID-19 has exacerbated many of the economic losses, especially for those in precarious jobs. And those that rely on public transport stand to lose one of the only forms of transport available to them if public transport is not prioritized as we emerge from this crisis. So what's the solution? We believe it is aligned action. Our results and recommendations from this outlook are a contribution to this. First off, the policy measures we look at, they tackle decarbonization, so from an environmental perspective. But beyond that, they also help job creation, they help improve the economic efficiency of cities, and connect people to these jobs. From a social perspective, many measures focus on improving access for groups like children, older people, women, people with mobility restrictions, whose travel needs have been poorly catered to in our existing systems. We also highlight where some decarbonization measures, especially those involving pricing, need to be considered with an understanding of the local context and exactly who will be affected, how and to what extent, to ensure that they are implemented fairly and effectively. One of the most important ways to align these goals is to move from mobility-focused policies to accessibility-focused policies. What do we mean by this? Accessibility-focused policies ensure that people have access to opportunities and goods without putting the focus on traveling more or traveling faster. It's good for people, it's good for the environment, and it makes good economic sense. These are the policies to encourage denser neighborhoods where you can work, send your kids to school, shop, meet friends. And when you do need to go elsewhere in your region or in the city, you can easily access a transport hub where you can use public transport or shared mobility if that's more appropriate, using a variety of other sustainable modes, ideally walking, cycling, scooters. Some of us got a glimpse of this during the pandemic as we walked and cycled more and our trips stayed closer to home. Wouldn't it be convenient if all our errands were also easier to complete close by? This is very different to the mobility-focused, private car-centric model that has been traditionally used in transport planning. It leads to building more and wider roads, inducing more and more car traffic. These principles of accessibility apply also to freight, moving from longer supply chains and faster transport to consolidating loads and shorter, more resilient supply chains. Accessibility-focused policies help to reduce travel demand, but to a different extent based on sector. We see here the difference in demand in 2050 for each sector under the current policy trajectory and our most ambitious scenario. In cities, accessibility-focused policies have a significant impact lowering demand. People travel 22% less. Freight as well achieves an 18% reduction in activity through shortened supply chains, asset sharing, consolidation of loads, and so on. In regional and intercity travel, or non-urban passenger transport, demand reduction is very difficult. Lower volumes of people are traveling over longer distances. This is especially true for regional travel between rural areas and between rural areas and cities. Much of the demand reduction we see overall for this sector is actually due to a reduction in air travel between cities in our most ambitious scenario. So it is important to realize that the types of measures we apply to different sectors will depend on their unique characteristics. Regional differences will also come into play. My colleagues will be going into the sector-specific details in the following sessions. But for now, generally speaking, traveling outside of cities where possible should be shifted to cleaner modes, such as rail. But globally, the largest benefit we see in terms of just the CO2 reduction comes from cleaner technology. And this applies to trucks, buses, cars, all motorized transport. However, we don't yet have the ability to shift completely away from fossil fuel-based technologies. We do need more development to decarbonize the sector. We need to invest in developing new fuels and vehicles that are affordable and available quickly. We need to encourage their adoption by providing financial incentives and investing in public charging infrastructure. It is crucial that we target shared and high-use vehicle fleets, such as delivery vehicles, buses, shared mobility, so we can reap the most benefits compared to just private cars. Lastly, improvements don't need to be in vehicles and fuels alone. We can already optimize operations through data sharing and digitalization so that, for example, by having access to real-time information, you can use the most efficient route. This has immense benefits for both passenger travel and freight transport. Last of all, in order to achieve any of the policy strategies mentioned before, we need to seek out greater collaboration outside of the transport sector, and even within its more disparate parts. Moving to clean transport means relying on alternative energy sources. So if you have an electric bus fleet, you're not going to be truly zero emission unless your electricity grid is also based on renewable energy. Sectors such as trade and tourism are deeply connected to the transport industry. And during the pandemic, we saw very clearly what an important economic role tourism plays. To ensure the long-term sustainability of the industry, sustainable transport will be central. The private and public sector collaboration is becoming increasingly important as new mobility services are introduced from the private sector. We need to boost their social benefits, but keep the environmental and social costs in check, which requires closer relationships with public authorities. And bringing us back all the way to the point on accessibility, land use and transport planning must be integrated to achieve greater access to opportunities without forcing people to travel more. In closing, of the 6 policy takeaways that we have discussed, at the very least, the 4 to walk away with today are: number 1, we need to increase ambition. We are not headed in the right direction with our existing policies. 2, we need to align economic recovery with these decarbonization initiatives and those to create more equitable transport systems. We can achieve this by focusing on access to opportunities and not more travel. And beyond that, we will need to rely on further technological development to move away from fossil fuel dependency. The longer we wait to make these changes, the harder and more drastic they will need to be to limit global warming. And we are at a very unique time in history. As we recover from this global crisis, and as countries are revising their commitments to the Paris Agreement targets, the transport outlook shows that we have a chance, if we act now, to reshape transport for a cleaner environment and fairer societies. Thank you very much for your attention during this presentation. I look forward to hearing from you during our Q&A session, and I'll hand the floor back to Orla.
Thank you, Malithi, for that great overview of the findings from the Outlook. I would now like to invite you to stay and to ask Luis Martinez, our lead modeler, to join us so we can discuss some of the points that we know to be of interest. I would invite participants to please use the Q&A function, and we would be very interested to know what your questions are. But Malithi and Luis, if you will indulge me. So we know from our work that public transport is the big question. You know, we are asked about, after COVID, what is public transport going to do? So Malithi, perhaps I can come to you first and ask, what, based on the Outlook, can we do to boost public transport going forwards?
Thanks, Orla. It's very true. Public transport is one of the biggest questions right now, and it will remain one of our key parts of a sustainable transport network. We identify it in all our scenarios that needs to be the backbone. And so what the pandemic has perhaps revealed to us is some shortcomings in how public transport is funded or financed in some cities. It doesn't necessarily reflect the very unique role that public transport plays, both from an environmental perspective and a social perspective. Many people rely on public transport as one of their only forms of transport. And environmentally speaking, there's really no alternative to how efficient it is in moving large numbers of people. So coming out of the pandemic, we need to maintain and increase our support for public transport. If there's drops in services, less coverage of routes, less reliability, it stands to lose ridership, which could really threaten the ability to achieve some of our sustainable transport goals. There will need to be creativity in how we finance. This could look like transit-oriented development and leveraging land value. It could look like employer contributions, et cetera. There are numbers of ways to move beyond a fare-based financing for public transport. And we also identify in the Outlook the need to shift our priority from spending on private car-related infrastructure to a more diverse set: public transport, active travel. We do need people to get to public transport safely and effectively. So I would say that it's a combination of those things, but very important to keep supporting public transport after the crisis.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for that. And we do have some questions coming in now. So Luis, I will turn to you first, if that's okay. We have a question here from Nicolas. What are the main inflections compared to the last Transport Outlook, please?
Okay, thank you, Orla. Good morning, all. The main inflections from the previous report, I would interpret this in the changes on the forecast that we have from one report to the other. I think they are dual. I think we revise the transport demand growth to reduce compared to our 2019 publication. And the main two reasons for this are reliant on the expected economic growth that was already forecasted for the previous outlook on the next decades, but also the role of some measures that were already implemented in the this years or are forecasted to be implemented in the next years that will already reduce significantly some of this induced demand that we were saying if we are focused more in mobility than in accessibility. And this was mainly due to the initiatives that were taken on the urban sector.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Luis, and thank you, Nicola, for that great question. And Luis, you mentioned about the change from mobility to accessibility, and that is indeed another question we have here from Mathilde. Malithi, I think probably we start with you on this one. So many countries are developing mobility-based policies, but now obviously we're recommending the move to adopting an accessibility approach. So how can we convert the existing trend that was at the time considered to be a great innovation? What are we actually saying to policymakers in terms of how they take this forwards?
That is a great question. And one of the reasons perhaps that we're still focused on these mobility-based policies is that we're still thinking of the private car as our main mode of transport. And so of course, if you want to travel smoothly with a private car, you want wide lanes, you want faster travel and less congestion. However, this doesn't take into account some of the externalities of such development. There are safety costs, there are environmental costs, there are health costs to neighborhoods where you can't really walk and go about your day doing your errands in an active manner. There are mental health costs associated with the air pollution, noise pollution. So there are a number of these disbenefits that we don't necessarily account for. And what we do disproportionately account for is travel time savings. And these are often going to point you in the direction of mobility-focused policies that benefit a smaller portion of the population than if you looked at a more holistic accessibility-focused view. So I would say that perhaps one of the answers to this question is that we need to be careful about what value we put on certain benefits and what we actually include in our analysis when deciding on these projects.
Excellent, thank you very much. And thank you, Mathilde, for that question. So we have a question now, which I think links to a number of key topics for the ITF and our wider work. And Brendan is asking about, following up on that public transport question. So focusing on public transport is all well and good, but what do we do about lower density regions? So the suburbs and rural areas, and going further than that, I would say, you know, how does the decentralization of cities potentially impact what we can hope to achieve?
Yes.
Luis, go ahead.
Thank you. If what we need when we say that and what we mean when we say that the public transport should be the central or the backbone of all the system, we are mainly saying that for the main corridors, for the high load demands, we want to keep public transport as the backbone and be the structure of it. But we have to also upgrade public transport formulation and use the technologies that we have currently to go into more real-time planning on, especially in low demand areas where we go on demand systems and rely also on shared mobility services to feed into the backbone that will be the main infrastructure base of public transport. Then I think this information, data availability and the digitalization will also be the key element that will put all this together. Also, we should not forget the increase on mobility as a service, as a trend that is just under discussion, but we see that a lot of developments recently and going forward in several countries. And what we are changing the mentality also of people of being a vehicle-based mobility, where we get a vehicle and then we want to use it for all purposes, to have a service-based mobility where we use the transport that is more suited for the purpose and for the situation. And I think this could be really also a game change in urban mobility, but also in less peri-urban or rural areas.
Great, thank you very much, Luis. And if, Meliti, perhaps I could pivot slightly on this topic to you from a policymaker's perspective. Luis has mentioned digitization and innovation, and we have another question come in here from Eric on mobility poverty. So how do we ensure that vulnerable citizen groups, such as elderly people, people with disabilities, or potentially those who may not have the wherewithal to engage with a digitized mobility system, what policies are there to account for them?
For sure. So the importance of digitalization, I would say, is partially to, as Luis mentioned, for people to access these new services, but even more so to optimize the running of these services that Luis has mentioned. From a user perspective, it is going to be extremely important, as long as we have a digital divide, that that alternatives are available for groups that may not have access or don't use such technologies like a smartphone. And beyond that, the services, there will always be a need for specific dedicated services, of course. But for kind of groups who could use public transport, or could, use some sort of active mode, or use a sidewalk to get where they need to go, if we do improve the walking and cycling and micromobility infrastructure, anyone on wheels would benefit from an environment that does not have as many obstacles. We have access to public transport at grade. Those types of examples do expand the existing public transport and active networks to a greater portion of the population. But I would say that it's true, there will, I believe, need to be dedicated services as well, and we're not advocating against that, for sure.
Excellent. Thank you both. And thank you to Brendan and Eric. And Brendan, I would just mention that one of my colleagues is currently doing work on innovative mobility for peripheral communities. You'll find that information on our website. So if it is an area that you're interested in, I would encourage you to go and look it up. We've touched on, sort of fairness there and equity, which is obviously a key theme of the outlook as a whole. Luis, perhaps I could come to you. What are the incentives for developing countries, not looking to simply follow up, but to in fact potentially leapfrog other countries and achieve a decarbonization where other countries may be a little bit slower behind? Could you comment a little bit more on that in terms of fairness and opportunity costs, perhaps, please?
Yes, thank you, Orla, for that question. I would say that the challenges and the opportunities are there. The challenges is also to change a little bit the mindset, especially in developing countries, that you see still a car or the ability of private mobility as a target in your life life targets. And this is something that we need to change, but also it's an opportunity, if we are not still there, to change mentalities, but also for the authorities to provide the services and the infrastructure that allows also the inhabitants with less resources to access, not to move, but just further and further. Then there is a need for a better connection between land use and transport to when we're creating when we have in a very fast areas where there is a very fast growth, it's very difficult to plan. And normally it comes with sprawl, it comes with creating of urban connect areas of the city that are not connected to public transport. And this has to be one thing that authorities have to plan ahead. To try to increase the planning, we have to be aware that there is the role of course, there is very fast growth in urban areas because there is this need, but then maybe we have to rely initially in alternatives of public transport that allow this penetration in these areas with that are growing faster, but already plan and use digitalization for this, and then plan public transport as a backbone for all mobility within this. This is also an opportunity of reducing the investment in other types of resources that we have in infrastructure, because as Maliti mentioned, what we are currently doing in most of the cities, or we do it in the last 30 years, is creating more highways, more motorways, or increasing the space consumed. Then there is also an opportunity to migrate part of this infrastructure investment to other type of investment that would be more on digitalization, on services, and also on the provision of the backbone infrastructure of public transport in this area, these cities that are growing very fast. It's complicated, but it's a challenge, but I think it's also an opportunity for us to do a leapfrogging, as you mentioned.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Now, we only have a minute left on the questions. So, Maliti, perhaps I could just come back to you very quickly in terms of looking forwards from where we are now. And obviously, we've observed very rapid changes, as our virtual summit attests, to how people work and commute. Do we have any thoughts on how changes in these patterns might affect sustainable transport in cities in the future?
Thanks, Orla. Yes, this is a big question, and I'm not going to pretend that we have a concrete answer for this. When people stop commuting, well, of course, it also depends on how much teleworking takes off in the future. This has been a grand experiment, but in terms of longevity of these trends, we don't know. We do also know that it's not the majority of jobs that can switch to telework. So assuming that a large portion of the people who do continue to telework, the changes to transport will depend. If we're moving away from traveling via metro into the city center, and instead you're going to complete some local trips close to home by walking to the grocery store, maybe biking somewhere, that will look very different to if a trip is replaced by longer trips for errands, if this is happening in a more car-centric suburb. So really the trade-off is that once people stop commuting, they do replace those trips with other trips. The nature of the trips that are being replaced will determine what the net effect will be. So right now, I would say it remains to be seen. We do think that it probably will have a net positive impact, especially from a teleconferencing and business travel point of view, as well as urban trends. But we'll have to wait and see.
TBC. Okay, thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, that is all we have time for this session. I'd like to thank Maliti and Luis for answering questions. I hope those of you watching will join us for our next session, which will focus on urban passenger transport. And we will be joined by our distinguished guest speaker, Marusha Kardama, the Secretary General of the SLOCAT Partnership. To navigate to that session, just use the back to timeline option in the top right-hand corner or left-hand corner, possibly, of your screen, and choose the morning session for urban passenger transport. For those of you leaving us, the Outlook is available on the ITF webpage, and from that you will be able to get links to summaries, results, and it will also be available, the results will be available to download from the OECD statistics webpage. That is all I have time for now, but I hope to see you again shortly in that next session, and have a lovely day. Hello, everyone. You are very welcome, and welcome back to those of you who have already joined us for our overview session this morning. Thank you for joining us to launch the Transport Outlook 2021, ITF's flagship publication. In this session, we are going to focus on the results for urban mobility more closely. And I will be joined by my colleagues Mallory Trouvé and Joshua Patinina Blanco to present the results for this chapter. We will then be joined for more in-depth discussion by our distinguished guest, Marusha Kardama, the Secretary General of the SLOCAP Partnership. Throughout this session, I invite you to please use the Q&A box on your screen to submit questions. And you will also be able to see a poll question, just a quick poll to get your thoughts on a question related to urban mobility, which will inform some of the discussion later. And the poll will remain open during the presentation, so please do take a look and submit your preferences. There is also a discussion box, which is there for participants to discuss amongst themselves, but I would ask you to please note that ITF staff will not be monitoring or moderating the content in this discussion box. So again, any questions you wish to be addressed by the participants, please include them in the Q&A box. Finally, should you experience any technical difficulties, you will see a small red live support button to the top right-hand corner of your screen. And I would invite you to please use that to communicate with the technical team to get help. And with that, I will now ask Mallory and Joshua to present the Outlook findings for urban mobility. And I believe, Mallory, you're to speak first, please.
Thank you, Ola. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Mallory Trouvé, and I'm going to present the results for the urban passenger transport sector from the ITF Transport Outlook 2021 with my colleague Joshua Patanina Blanco. We want to highlight first that Maliti Fernando is also an author of this analysis. So in this session, we will focus on how cities can make mobility sustainable, equitable, and resilient. So first, a quick reminder of what has just been said in the introductory session. So the ITF Transport Outlook 2021 aims on producing estimations of transport demand, CO2 emissions, and other indicators such as resilience, accessibility. These estimations are between 2015 and 2050. In order to do so, we built three main policy scenarios. So first, the recover scenario, which is the current trajectory where the policies that we are implementing right now are leading us. The reshape scenario, which is a paradigm shift from the recover scenario. Basically, the same policies, but with a higher uptake. So for instance, higher congestion charging, quicker vehicle electrification, or stronger incentives for active and micromobility. And last, the reshape plus scenario, which is a reinforced reshape, building on a stronger recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. So while the ITF Transport Outlook encompasses all of the transport sector, this session focuses on urban passenger transport, meaning the daily mobility of people in a city setting. All of the urban areas over the world are considered in this analysis. So I'll start by presenting the main findings of our analysis, and then my colleague Joshua will present the main takeaways that we can draw from this. So first, an observation. According to the UN, the urban population is set to increase by 68% by 2050. This is a strong growth, which is also combined with an expected economic growth of urban areas, which translates into a strong growth of urban travel demand, which is expected to almost triple by 2050. So there is the huge pressure on the demand side of urban passenger transport. When we look at the emissions that are produced by the urban passenger transport sector, if we stay on the current trajectory, they roughly remain the same. But if we have more ambitious policies and if we leverage the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemics, then we could aim at reducing these emissions in 2050 by almost 80%. That would be reduced by a fifth. This is necessary if we want to reach the goals set by the climate agreements. when we look at how these emissions are produced, which modes are producing them, it appears that private vehicles are responsible for 75% of these emissions, which is very significant. We must also consider that they only represent 51% of the demand. So we can say that private vehicles today are the highest emitting mode. They're also very space intensive, especially when you have just one people per car, for instance. They are not available to everyone because it's expensive to purchase or maintain such vehicles. But the paradox is that most of the transport systems are designed for them. So a lot of the urban space is dedicated to the use of private vehicles. The goal here is not to say that private vehicles are bad, because they are an interesting solutions, but the way we use them today is not efficient enough if we want to reach the goals of climate agreements. And last, the resilience topic is one that we wanted to address in this ITF Transport Outlook 2021. But it's fairly difficult to address it because there are many definitions of resilience. In this analysis, we consider resilience as the modal diversity of a city. So basically, there is the assumption that we make the assumption that the higher the modal diversity, the better the system will be able to answer disruption of a certain mode. So when we look at 2015 and 2050 under the current trajectory, the equilibrium roughly stays the same. We just note the operation of shared mobility in the current trajectory. While if we look at the ambitious policies and leverage recovery from COVID-19, we have a much stronger uptake of shared mobility and of active mobility at the expense of private vehicle and paratransit mode shares. So the system becomes more resilient. So the conclusion of this is that increasing the variety of sustainable modes can increase resiliency. So now I hand the screen to my colleague Joshua, who will present the main takeaways.
Thank you, Mallory. So to present our 4 main takeaways. The first one is that 2 main strategies are needed to be able to better manage demand and deliver sustainable transport services across the world. One strategy for developing regions and another one for developed regions. So if we look at the graph at the left, we see the evolution of per capita transport demand in developed in dark blue and developing regions in light blue from 2015 to 2050. We can see that in the current trajectory, if ambition is not increased, demand is going to increase slightly in OECD countries, but it's going to do so massively in non-OECD ones. As a result of this, as we see in the graph in the right, per capita CO2 emissions are going to stay roughly the same in 2050 as they were in 2015 in non-OECD countries. They're not going to decrease as much as they should have in OECD ones for us to meet wider environmental sustainability objectives. Now, to be able to face this very unsustainable situation, 2 strategies are needed. One, in developing world regions, is to leapfrog unsustainable demand growth patterns. This is to say, to move away from the trend of having high levels of long-distance mobility by unsustainable modes, but rather focusing in transport innovations which can help deliver a more sustainable future. In developed regions, on the other hand, the idea is to optimize the very high levels of already existing transport demand, for instance, by increasing vehicle occupancy rates. Now, a second takeaway is that there is a common policy principle that can help achieve these 2 strategies for developing and developed regions alike. This principle is crucial, and it is to increase access to nearby opportunities and having this policy priority, for instance, by integrating transport policy and land use planning. The idea behind this is to create cities that are neighborhood-centric. Imagine cities where it will be possible to reach essential opportunities such as school, work opportunities, shops or hospitals very close to where we live, and where mobility systems are designed to this end. Now, if we do this, first, we can shorten distances of trips. And then those trips that we can do them by walking, by cycling, or by using public transport in a way that's cost effective for authorities. With the right policies that think about equity and the social sustainability of systems, it will be possible with this policy approach to really increase access for all, for those who do not own a private vehicle, but also for those who have a particular impairment or who are otherwise disadvantaged by the current mobility system. Now let's look just at some of the potential impacts that such an approach could have. As you see in the left, if we increase ambition and aim at increasing access for all, by 2050, demand still increases, but much less than if we didn't have this approach. And the important thing is that if we increase ambition and leverage on the COVID-19 pandemic recovery, for instance, for increasing sustainable modes such as cycling in cities around the world, then it will be possible to double emission reductions that we could have by 2050. There is a third takeaway, which is that a common principle behind all of these measures is to reduce the reliance on private vehicles for decarbonizing cities. Without such an approach, it will not be possible to really decarbonize our cities around the world. Increasing ambition means to reflect the real cost of using a car for society, but also to improve vehicle technologies in a way that can deliver cleaner fleets. Now, if ambition doesn't change, by 2050, private vehicles will fulfill 40% of demand and emit around 50% of emissions stemming from the urban passenger transport sector. But with more ambition, if we leverage correctly on the COVID-19 pandemic recovery, around 1/3 of demand would be answered by private vehicles. And these private vehicles would emit less than 1/3 of all emissions. Now, it's important to provide a real alternative to private vehicle use, especially in lower income areas, so that we don't leave anybody behind and people can still move in spite of these changes on priority away from private vehicle use. But what does it mean to provide alternatives? And this is our fourth takeaway. It means to create a multimodal urban transport system that has public transport at its backbone. And for this, integrating public transport and shared mobility services is going to be essential. First, because this integration can offer last mile connectivity in areas where previously existing public transport services couldn't reach because of low levels of demand. But then it can also make the use of transport vehicles more efficient. So imagine that instead of having one person in one vehicle, we could have 3 or 4. Of course, emissions per capita and the consequences of cars per capita would be lesser in such an approach. If we think about this and provide also a reliable, frequent, clean, and safe transport system for all, and in safety, we need to think particularly about women, it will be possible to attract new users. And this is the key for a more sustainable future. So just to wrap up, we have 4 main facts and takeaways that come from this presentation. First, urbanization will increase demand for sustainable transport around the world. And to better manage demand, it will be needed to leapfrog unsustainable demand patterns in developing regions, but then also to optimize existing demand in developed ones. With the right policies, it will be possible, in the second place, to cut around 80% of urban mobility's carbon footprint by 2050. And this is great, but this will only be possible if we have an approach that focuses on providing access for nearby opportunities for all. Now, this means a way that we look at the current emission of private vehicles, 3/4 of CO2 emissions, and we aim at reducing the reliance on private vehicles for really decarbonizing our cities. This can allow having a more sustainable system, which can also increase resilience. Such a system will only be possible if we have public transport as the backbone of multimodal transport sustainable cities for the future. Thank you very much. And I hand up the mic to the moderator, Orla. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you both very much for that overview of the urban mobility results for the outlook. And I can see many of our participants are responding to that poll, some interesting results coming in. I would encourage you to please continue to do so for the next few minutes, and I will close the poll after Marusha has spoken. I would also encourage you, if you have more specific questions for our presenters, to please use the Q&A function to submit them so that we can discuss them later in the session. Well, it is now my great pleasure to invite Marusha Kardama, the Secretary General of the SLOCAT Partnership, to join us. Marusha, you are very welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join us today and for sharing your insights and thoughts on some of those results.
Thank you so very much, Orla. Thanks to Mallory and to Joshua and also to Melissa for the amazing job. The first thing I should do is really congratulate you. It's never easy to pull one of these big Outlook reports together, and particularly doing it in the year that you had to do it. So congratulations, phenomenal urban chapter. And there is a few things, perhaps 6 things that have particularly caught my attention and I would like to underscore here. The first one is really congratulate you for putting really social aspects at the center of your analysis. You're really making us see how access to mobility and resilience of mobility systems at the end are absolutely central to the resilience of urban communities. And at the end of the day, you're also helping us understand the extent to which it is about democratizing the access to mobility, democratizing the shared use of public space, and therefore democratizing the access to socioeconomic opportunities, which at the end of the day is what transport is all about. Another thing that I like a lot about the Outlook this year is the extent to which it is anchored on the avoid, shift, and improve framework. And in that order, how much you're underscoring that first, we need to reduce the need for motorized trips in cities, to then shift to less carbon intensive modes, to finally look into the efficiency of vehicles and of fuels. And actually, I like the way how you're presenting that sequence is very feasible if we really take the right ambitious policies. Another thing that I like a lot about the Outlook and is connected to this framework of hierarchies of strategies is that you're not shying away from actually telling us the very bad things about the prevalent rates of private car use. Sometimes I think, what is it that as a sustainable low carbon transport movement we could be doing in order to help us shift away from these car dependent lifestyles that we've got? I think that perhaps something that we could do is tell better the data, the very concrete data to decision makers and citizens of the cost of not acting on this excessive use of our private cars. Costs in terms of inequality, of air pollution, of road crashes, of a productivity because of the loss of time in congestion, isn't it? And of course, that means as well telling the story about the savings for the public policy areas and the great economies of scale that there derive. I think that we might also want to tell the story of not depending so much on our cars in a wider framework, society-wide framework for equitable, healthy, low carbon lifestyles, inserting the less dependency on cars in that wider conversation. A fourth thing that I like a lot is the extent to which you are reminding us that centrality of public transport as the backbone of any mobility system in a city. I could say any system that really wants to be about equity and that really wants to be a low carbon one. I think that we also need to understand that in this moment in which we are trying to rejuvenate the life of our cities after the pandemic, if we allow public transport systems to collapse, we are only going to exacerbate other series of crises that are already ongoing. The social inequality crisis, the air pollution crisis, and of course the emissions crisis. So it's really time to support local governments, which as we know are really carrying on their shoulders in many instances the burden of delivering public transport services to urban dwellers. A fifth thing that I appreciate a lot from your Outlook is those 3 scenarios. You're really raising the ambition bar. You're really making a clear case for the right type of investments. You're providing sound knowledge for policymakers. So what is it that I think we expect from the policymakers? I think that we expect, as you're also saying, those integrated and intermodal metropolitan transport plans. We know we've been talking about them over many years, and we know that they still are an outstanding matter in many geographies. To change the tide, we are really going to have to see a much increased number of national urban mobility plans and sustainable urban mobility plans across different geographies. And perhaps we're going to have to understand them not just as that isolated measure, but as a package of integrated intermodal measures at that metropolitan scale that actually sells mobility and understands mobility as a service to citizens. How can we support policymakers? Well, probably I think that organizations such as ours, we can look into more support to political, to local elected representative support at the technical and at the political level in the use of regulatory mechanisms, whether it is establishing low emission zones, whether it is introducing congestion charges that we know are difficult moves sometimes to take, isn't it? And we probably need to support much better the transport professionals so we truly integrate, as you were saying, spatial planning, land use, urban development, and transport planning. I very much concur with Joshua. I think that this refreshed interest in urban and transport planning policies that are based on proximity, like the 15-minute city, really carry a lot of potential for us to build upon. And the last thing that I appreciate a lot from this outlook is your very clear recommendation in the urban mobility chapter about prioritizing funding for sustainable urban transport development. I think that it is time to reinterpret what we consider is added value for investments in urban transport. We have seen over the past decade a lot of calls from many different voices telling us to what extent there is sustainability and low carbon benefits for this type of investment. Still, the adequate investment at scale doesn't exist everywhere, particularly in the global south. So I could say that as we are seeing an unprecedented amount of money being mobilized in recovery packages, it will be as essential as ever that we understand transport policies at the urban level, also as financing and investment schemes, sending very specific signals about what should and should not be actually invested, financed over the next decade, because that next decade is going to determine the urban mobility transformations that are going to be feasible. And I would close with saying that perhaps what we need to do is interrogate any investment in urban transport over the next few years, according to the gains it can actually give us across 3 impact areas. And to me, those 3 impact areas would be access to mobility with different options, could be reducing carbon emissions, and could also be the aspect of generating jobs, because we know that around improved measures, around technology measures, there is a beautiful story there to be told of a jobs generation, for instance, around electric mobility. Absolutely. So congratulations again. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here with you today. And over to you, Orla. Thank you.
Thank you, Marusha. A lot of food for thought there, both for policymakers, I think, but also for us as analysts in how we can support them to take those policies forwards. So I will now end the poll. We have quite a number of results, and if we could share the results, please, great, thank you very much. So this question was about decarbonisation measures for urban mobility, and there was a mixture of, you know, sort of mode shift, long-term planning, and drivers of demand type questions. And what is interesting to me, at least, is that there is no runaway measure that has attracted a large majority of the votes, or indeed a majority of the votes at all. But what we can see is that mode shift, the promotion of active mobility and the promotion of public transport have both come out at around the 16-17% mark of proportion of responses as being the measures that participants would suggest for the decarbonisation of urban passenger transport. So Marusha, perhaps we could quickly just pop back to you, please. Do you have any thoughts on this result?
I mean, it's super interesting, Orla, because to some extent, I think that the notion is, what do we think authorities should be doing? Or what do we think would be the easiest for them to do, isn't it? And obviously, depending on what level of government we would be talking about, it could be easier or less easy for certain levels of government, local level, subnational level, or national level to act, depending on the country we would be at. Very, I think, heartwarming to see that everybody understands that behavioral change that we've seen in patterns towards active mobility is to be harnessed. I think that hopefully we will see the prevailing hurdles for bringing up to scale infrastructure for active mobility removed with recovery measures, and all these temporary approaches to tactical urbanism that have been so cost efficient to be harnessed as permanent, irreversible change in our cities across different geographies. I am very pleased to see public transport so highly scoring there. I cannot sufficiently underscore how central it is for us to work on it, but let's not take for granted that it's going to be easy. In many countries around the world, local authorities are not accessing the financing schemes needed in order to actually keep the services running. Let's look backward just a couple of months ago to New York. A city like New York was actually struggling to keep public transit alive. So I think we have to be mindful of that, absolutely. Interesting, I don't know how did it score the measures about pricing mechanisms, because interestingly, they might not be easy, but at the end of the day, we shouldn't forget that governments, authorities have got the power of regulation. And therefore, you know, we could hope that they could use that power of regulation for changing mobility paradigms in our cities. But enough from me, because I would love to hear from others, of course. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Marusha. And just so participants understand, our speakers can't actually see the poll results. So Marusha, pricing mechanisms did not do too badly. It got about 9%. Apart from the two that we spoke about in terms of modes, everything else ranged between about 7 and 12%. So I think there's probably reflecting of the fact that there isn't a silver bullet solution, but that it's going to be a mixed bag of measures that are required. So thank you very much for your thoughts on that. I will now ask Mallory to perhaps share some comments from the ITF perspective on those results, please.
Thank you, Ola. Thank you, Marusha, for your comments and for your first interpretation of these polls. I would add another perspective from the modeling side. When we developed this outlook, we really wanted to go over the traditional transport sector analysis, which is based on travel demand and CO2 emissions, but to integrate the social aspects and the resilience aspects. And it's something that we tried to do in this outlook. It was rather difficult because there are, on the modeling side, it's difficult to put figures behind this, and we often don't have the numbers. And here, what it shows is that really these polls show that all of the measures are important, have some social aspects, and we are trying to reflect these aspects in the models. This outlook shows the first trial to do so, and we aim on improving our representation of social and resilience aspects in the future with switching from mobility to accessibility approaches.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mallory. So we can now start taking some questions from our audience. And we have a question here from Nathaniel, which is marked as a question for Joshua, but I think probably either of you could comment on this. So it comes to the focus of the source of the carbon emissions for our models. And the question is essentially, why take just, you know, the immediate tailpipe emissions? Shouldn't the ITF also be looking at overall emissions? So from the manufacture of batteries and other energy storage systems, so life cycle emissions. I'm not sure which of you, Joshua, do you want to take the first response on that? Great, thank you.
Thank you, and of course, Mallory can jump in and complement my answer. But on this, I think that this question is essential. The idea is to be able to take into account both direct and indirect emissions. And this is because, especially when we think about electrification, at the end of the day, these measures are not going to be successful unless the actual energy mix that generates this electricity is taken into account and is clean as well. So in the outlook, we did take into account these different sources of emissions, but of course, there needs to be further attention in the future on this. And you can actually read a little bit of how these shares of direct versus indirect emissions evolve in the future. In the future, actually, if we put on measures that seek to clean vehicle fleets, then the indirect emissions stemming from road transport is going to increase its share depending on how clean the electricity matrix is. So this is going to be key.
Great, thanks, Joshua. Mallory, do you have anything to add on that?
Not much. Well, what we can say, it's also why electrifying the vehicle fleet, why technology improvement is not the only solution, because there are always drawbacks at some point. We really must have the whole set of measures, with measures enabling to shifting modes and to avoiding some trips that are not necessary.
Great, thank you, Mallory. Okay, so, and thank you to Nathaniel for the questions. So we have a question here also then from Alana, and this relates to, we talk a lot about public transport in this session and the last one, but here's a question on what are the opportunities and policy measures for formalizing informal public transport services, and is this a priority? And Joshua, I can see you nodding, so I'm going to ask you to respond on this one, please.
Of course. Formalization in developing regions is essential, and the way it's done can actually shape in the future our emissions and how sustainable systems are. If you look at the paratransit share, informal transport share in developing regions, you see that in our most ambitious scenario, we assume a certain formalization rate that can allow these paratransit services to be integrated into shared mobility. And this integration is what allows, thanks to a strong public transport system, for the most emissions reduction. But this is assuming that formalization takes place in a way that's properly integrated with public transport. If this is not the case, then on the opposite, expansion of informal services in the future would actually be very detrimental to the evolution of emissions. So the way in which formalization takes place is essential. Now, we didn't look too much into the political economy of how these changes would need to take place, because these are very context specific, but it's crucial that when formalizing, these informal transport services become integrated in a sustainable manner into the public transport services of cities in developing regions.
Great, thank you, Joshua. And just while we're on the public transport, a quick question I have, which I think probably will come up, and Mallory, excuse me, perhaps you could answer this one. So we talk about public transport being the backbone, but in our most ambitious scenario, in fact, its mode share on a trip basis appears to be lower than in the other scenarios. So perhaps you could just make some comment on that for our audience, please.
Yeah, thank you, Ola. Yeah, actually, this is an interesting question, and when we look at the results, it's first disturbing to show this share that is diminishing or mostly staying the same. But when we look at these figures, we must also consider that the demand is growing a lot. So actually, if we look at the values of the demand for public transport, it is increasing. It is not. The only thing is that it is not increasing as much as other modes. So it's here, it's growing. We need public transport, but in the mode share, it's less visible, because shared mobilities are also developing a lot to capture the area of the demand that are less difficult to capture by public transit, because it's not efficient enough for this. There's not the density, for instance. Yes, public transport is there, even if the mode share is slightly decreasing.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying that, Mallory. So we have a question here then from Ada on automated vehicles. So how can automated vehicles be integrated into urban mobility systems to facilitate accessibility to opportunities? And Joshua, I think probably this one to you, please. Your thoughts on automated vehicles and urban mobility.
Of course. Thank you for that question. The automation of vehicles in the future can be a way of integrating publics that right now have a difficult time being integrated into the whole transport system at the urban level. For instance, people with discapacities. So this is definitely an alternative and a solution that needs to be taken into account. However, automated vehicles themselves will not be a panacea. And this means that if we don't take into account very carefully the way in which these automated vehicles work, if we don't take into account their environmental impacts, we can end up with cities that have many automated vehicles, which end up generating many empty trips and a lot of congestion. So, of course, a good solution that can in the future help bring access to a wider amount of users, but one which needs to be taken with a grain of salt.
Thank you, Joshua. And Mallory, I can see you nodding emphatically. Would you like to add a comment to Joshua's response?
Yes, well, what Joshua said is definitely true, and it depends on the model on which these automated vehicles are developed. If it's to replace private vehicles by private automated vehicles, there is a strong likelihood that it would generate a lot of empty trips in the cars who would just travel empty, while developing, having automated vehicles based on a shared mobility system would be probably much more efficient. So it depends on how they will evolve in the future.
Thank you, Mallory. And Marusha, I saw you appear briefly on screen there. Would you like to add a comment on in response to this question, please?
Well, a bit of a mixed in response to the previous ones, if I may, Orla.
Of course, please do.
An automatic private car remains a private car on the road, as Mallory was saying. So I think that's my only answer to this one, as much as, of course, it can serve to providing access for all, as Joshua was also saying. And I think I would like to bring here as well our attention to a study recently commissioned by the German government, which came up with the following findings, that something like 40% of the potential for emission reductions in transport will come from technology, whereas 60% of the potential for reductions of emissions will come from behavioral change and from shifting modes. So I think that tells us a lot. And then a word about public transport. I think that we shouldn't forget that the plummeting ridership is a behavioral aspect that all of us as citizens, we have to be thinking about. We are all going back to our cars on the streets, on the roads of our cities, because we all have different fears in this pandemic moment. So it's about, I think, working with that social psychology, with that, with all those different vectors that are super interesting. And because there was a question on informal transit, and because my team this morning flagged up to me, super interesting reading from SAAT, Myths and Realities of Informal Public Transport in Developing Countries. 17 myths to be debunked that I would absolutely recommend for those who are keen on the informal transport and want to complement the wonderful job of these Outlook 2021. So thanks a lot, Orla.
Thank you very much for that, Marusha. And perhaps the team could find that link and share it in the discussion box. And in fact, while I have you, Marusha, perhaps I can press you for a second answer, if that's okay. We have a question here from Nicolas on the role of the private sector. So while we're talking about what the different parties can do, we've spoken about policymakers. What do you think the role of the public sector could be in achieving that decarbonisation?
Of the private sector, the role of the private sector.
Apologies, private,
yeah.
yes.
No, I mean, I think there's an essential role here. I think that we shouldn't at all underestimate or neglect the innovation potential that so oftentimes comes straight from the private sector. Perhaps the friendly nuance I could add up to it is how are we going to be enabling innovation that somehow is connected to public policy goals for that access to urban mobility options, isn't it? But that private innovation must be absolutely enabled with different legal certainties and institutional frameworks. And another aspect that I think we shouldn't neglect at all is that in many geographies, informal transport services are actually private sector operated. So private sector, of course, needs to make profit. We shouldn't forget that. And if those private sector operated services collapse in many cities across the world, it's going to mean that no mobility options are going to be there, except for those who can actually own a car, from the minority who can own a car. So I think that absolutely the best combination would be to see governments at national level and at city level and private sector working together in integrated manners, and the governments at their level of responsibility enabling regulatory, fiscal, and policy frameworks that actually allow the private sector to do what they are super good at doing, which is filling market gaps, promoting innovation, and putting on the market solutions that many oftentimes the public sector cannot really invest in. Thanks. And thanks for the question to Nicola, absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Marusha, and apologies for being cheeky and keeping you on there when you had offered to answer another question. So we have two more questions. Unfortunately, we are out of time. For anyone who has any remaining questions or would like to discuss the outlook in more detail, members of the ITF team will be at the ITF exhibition stand over the course of the conference. So do please feel free to pop along and submit any questions you have there or discuss with my colleagues if they are on the stand. So unfortunately, as I say, we are out of time for the urban session. It has been very interesting, if a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I would like to say a very big thank you to Marusha for joining us today, for sharing her insights and for joining the discussion panel at the end. For those of you looking for more information on the Outlook itself is available on the ITF Outlook page, along with downloadable summaries and links to the OECD statistics, where the results can also be downloaded. If you do go to the ITF exhibition stand, there are executive summaries of the Outlook available in several languages, which you may find useful. And otherwise, all that is left is for me to encourage you to please stick with us again. My colleague Malithi will be taking over moderation for the non-urban passenger session, which follows in 5 minutes' time. You can navigate to that by using the back to timeline choice on the top of your screen and selecting the morning session for non-urban passenger transport. But otherwise, I wish you all a very good day and thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the non-urban passenger transport session of the ITF Transport Outlook launch. A warm welcome to those who have just joined the program, and hello again for those of us who have stayed with us. My name is Malithi Fernando, and I am a co-author and the project manager of this edition of the Outlook, and it is my absolute pleasure today to moderate this session. You will be hearing shortly from my colleagues Dimitrios Papaioannou and Vatsalia Sohu, who will be presenting our findings on the future of non-urban passenger transport. After that, we will be joined by our very special guest, Simone Raua, head of the Aviation Environmental Roadmap at Airbus. She'll be joining us for an interactive discussion, and you'll be welcome to participate in that through the poll on the right-hand side of your screen. Finally, Luis Martinez, the lead modeler of the ITF, will join Dimitrios and Vatsalia to answer your questions during the Q&A portion. So on the right-hand side of your screen, as mentioned, there's a poll question that you can answer at any point from now until after Simone joins us for the discussion. There's also a Q&A box that you're welcome to submit questions to. We will have some time after the presentation to go through them. There's also a discussion box. Now, this is for you to chat with other participants, but it will not be moderated by ITF staff, so please use the Q&A function for questions. Finally, if you are experiencing technical difficulties, please use the live support button on the top right-hand corner of the screen for assistance. And I believe that is it for housekeeping. With that, I will hand it off to Dimitrios and Vatsalia for their presentation. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. Here, we will be presenting some of our results, some of the key findings and main takeaways from the non-urban passenger chapter of our Outlook. Myself, Dimitrios Papaioannou, and Vatsalia Sohu will be presenting. Before we start, let's talk a bit what non-urban passenger is. So what do we mean when we're saying non-urban passenger? It is all passenger transport that happens outside and between cities. And I need to clarify this a bit more. When we talk about regional transport, we talk about things happening in rural and peri-urban areas, small daily trips happening by surface modes. When we are talking about intercity transport, we are talking about movements that happen between cities, and they can happen by surface modes or by ferries or by aviation. Now, why is non-urban passenger important? First of all, it represents more than half, about 60% of all passenger activity and the corresponding emissions. And further to that, it is a sector, especially some parts of it, that are notoriously hard to decarbonize. It is much more dependent on fossil fuels compared with some other sectors. Last but not least, it has also been significantly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Overall, activity was reduced by almost 40%. But as everyone knows, the pandemic particularly affected aviation, which faced a total reduction of activity of almost 60%. International aviation was even further affected, mainly due to border closures and quarantine requirements, facing a total reduction of almost 75%. Let's recap very briefly the three policy scenarios that we are testing in this outlook. First of all, we have the recover scenario. The recover scenario talks about our current trajectory, where we are going under our current policies and our announced and planned commitments. We also have the reshape scenario. The reshape scenario talks about a paradigm shift. It talks about scaling up our ambition, talks about going and taking bolder and more ambitious measures and policies. have to point out that both these scenarios assume that there are no after effects of the pandemic. By 2030, everything is back to normal. This is where our last scenario differ, the Reshape Plus. In this scenario, we leverage some of the effects of the pandemic to accelerate the uptake and deployment of decarbonization policies, which would allow us to reach our climate goals faster and with more certainty. Now, I'm going to present you some of our key facts, some of our key findings from our modeling work in the Transport Outlook. Let's talk first about demand. Demand measured in passenger kilometers for non-urban passenger transport, that is for regional and intercity, will grow. It will grow regardless of scenario. In all three scenarios, we are having very significant growth, more than double. As you can see in the graph, the difference between the current trajectory, the recover scenario, and the Reshape Plus scenario is rather small. We do have growing in both. That is because, as Malithi mentioned in the previous session, demand management for regional and intercity travel is rather hard. However, it is important to point out that we do have a dichotomy in terms of where this growth is coming from. In OECD countries, the growth of the sector is going to be about 40 to 45% in both scenarios shown here. By contrast, the demand for regional and intercity travel in non-OECD countries almost triples. This highlights a departure from OECD countries being the center of non-urban activity globally. By 2050, the developing non-OECD nations will generate the majority of non-urban passenger activity. Let's see how that translates in CO2 emissions. Here, we actually have two possible futures. Depending on the policies that will be taken, as represented by our scenarios, CO2 emissions from the sector could either rise or fall. Now, under the current policies, we see that CO2 emissions would grow almost 25% by 2050. Now, of course, comparing with the demand growth, which is about 100%, 114%, as shown in the previous slide, we see that there is reduction on the carbon intensity. However, it is not enough to decouple CO2 emissions from demand growth. However, on the other scenario, as you can see on the Reshape Plus, CO2 emissions could be reduced by as much as 57%. Here, we do have this decoupling between demand and CO2 emissions. But let's not forget that in order to reach the result outlined by this scenario, it will be necessary to leverage some of the after effects and the recovery packages of the pandemic. Now, let's talk a bit more specifically about aviation. Aviation, which is a significant part of the sector, will recover. It will recover, according to our estimates, by 2025, and it will continue growing. By 2050, air travel could almost triple when compared to the 2015 levels. And as I mentioned before, it is important to point out that decarbonizing aviation is hard. A lot of breakthroughs, technological design, or in policies will be needed in order for us to reduce emissions from aviation. However, as you can see on the graph, on the Reshape Plus scenario, we actually do have a reduction on the demand for air travel, at least compared to the current trajectory, the recover scenario. This is a result of the various policies taken, which lead to a mode shift, at least for short distance travel, which now can be done by surface modes, such as high-speed rail, but also as a result of trends, such as teleconferencing and increased local tourism, which will reduce overall aviation demand. And now with this, I conclude my presentation, and I pass the floor to my colleague, Vachalia Sohu.
Thank you very much, Dimitris, for those very insightful findings. As Dimitris mentioned, carbon emissions from this sector could be 57% lower in 2050 as compared to 2015, with ambitious policies that leverage the decarbonization opportunities of COVID-19 recovery. I will now present our key takeaways in this context. To begin with, our results show that technological improvements offer the most promising path to achieve the targets in this sector. This can be explained through the avoid, shift, improve approach in this context. So, avoiding travel by leveraging the trends that have emerged in the aftermath of the pandemic. For example, promoting local tourism and encouraging teleworking and video conferencing to avoid business trips. Secondly, shifting to cleaner modes, substituting short-haul flights for high-speed rail travel. This can be encouraged through designing recovery packages that help shift travel from air to rail. And we've already seen this, for example, with the French recovery package. And lastly, improving energy efficiency. For road transport, this can mean promoting the use of more energy efficient vehicles. And for aviation, this means encouraging new aircraft designs and the deployment of hybrid and electric aircraft, as well as increasing the use of sustainable aviation fuels through mandates. Moving on, to ensure the transition to low carbon mobility, it is important to increase consumer confidence in cleaner technologies and to push for a cleaner energy grid. Now, in order to increase consumer confidence, it is important to deploy charging infrastructure along intercity and regional networks to overcome range anxiety and accelerate adoption. Major push can also come from incentives. This can be through purchase subsidies, tax rebates, tax exemptions for electric vehicles. Specifically targeting rapid electrification of high usage fleets like vehicles and ride-hailing fleets can also have a very big impact. Secondly, pursuing a cleaner energy grid is key, as regional travel comes to rely more and more on electricity. Without green electricity, transport emissions will simply shift to the energy sector instead of being mitigated. And when we talk about pursuing a cleaner energy grid, it is very important to point out that emerging economies, which are still highly dependent on fossil fuels, must prioritize a transition to a greener grid. Last, but certainly not the least, putting a price on carbon will discourage high emission transport and make cleaner alternatives more attractive. Here, carbon taxes can play an important role in making CO2 intensive transport internalize the environmental as well as societal cost of carbon emissions. Additionally, when we talk about a just transition, it is important to design revenue neutral and fair schemes so as to not leave behind the less affluent. Lower income groups often bear the brunt of regressive taxation. Hence, it is essential to design these programs in a way that avoids unfair burden on these vulnerable groups. This can also mean using the revenue from carbon pricing to fund incentives for clean mobility so as to increase the acceptability of these alternatives. Now, to quickly summarize, we see from our findings that demand for regional and intercity travel will grow strongly regardless of the scenario. We also see a rebound in aviation and continued growth till 2050. This means that decoupling emissions from travel demand will be crucial, and it is possible to reduce emissions from this sector by 57% in 2050, only through deploying ambitious policies and leveraging the recovery from the pandemic. As mentioned, this can be achieved through measures like increased deployment of technological improvements and ensuring consumer confidence in them, greening the electricity grid, and implementing carbon taxation schemes that prioritize equity. I finish here, and I would like to thank you all very much for your time. And with that, I hand it back to our colleague, Malithi.
Thank you very much, Vatsalya and Demetrius, for those findings and those practical insights as to how we might achieve them. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Simone Raua from Airbus, who will be starting off our discussion, bringing an industry perspective, specifically from the aviation sector. Simone, thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Malithi, for the invitation to this important summit, and good day to everyone connected. So it's a pleasure to be here. So yes, first of all, I would like to say that it's very encouraging to see that the aviation sector is expected also in the ITF transport outlook to recover within all the three scenarios. The impacts have been particularly hard for the aviation sector. In the worst times, international traffic was down to 90%, and even today, more than 1 year later, the international traffic is still only at 25%. So the socioeconomic impacts are tremendous in the sector, but not only, also in its ecosystem. So for example, just to look at the tourism industry. So the recovery from this crisis remains the first priority for the sector. But being more positive and looking ahead, what is already clear today is that the sector will recover, and coming out of this crisis is it will recover differently. It will not be the same anymore. It will change significantly. So the current economic situation of the sector will lead to restructuration probably, and foremost to efficiency improvements of the system, which will bring a lot of opportunities also for the environment, for example, and to build back better as a whole. The fact that society's environmental considerations and awareness have increased significantly over the past years and accelerated by the crisis have made sustainability, I would say, the second first priority of the sector. So all this will require strong commitment and focused collaboration of all the stakeholders inside and outside the industry, and particularly also the energy sector, including strong and supportive policies and incentivizations. We at Airbus, we strongly believe in the significant social and economic benefits aviation brings to the society, uniting and connecting people, it has been said before, cultures and economies, offering at the same time very high system flexibility and speed. That's very important. And we also strongly believe in the capability of the aviation sector, including Airbus, to deliver the necessary innovation and breakthrough technologies. This was also highlighted, for example, by the Secretary General's opening speech on the need for innovation. So for Airbus, sustainable aviation fuels and hydrogen solutions are the most significant and promising decarbonization means. But of course, all measures, including ATM and operations of improvement, as well as market-based measures, are very important parts of the industries and Airbus decarbonization plans. So has been said also before, no one solution. So today, there's a lot of innovation ongoing in the sector, from startups to other bigger players to work on decarbonization. And Airbus specifically has recently presented its 3 zero-emission hydrogen-powered concept planes. We're working ahead, working on the technologies and pressing ahead on the hydrogen combustion and modified gas turbine engines, for example, but also fuel cells technologies. So our ambition is to bring the first commercial zero-emission plane to market by 2035. So these planes are all addressing short to medium range, intercity and intracontinental travel with ranges between 1,000 and 2,000 nautical miles. So falling also definitely into the report scope, and with capacities between up to 100 and 200 seats. So those future innovations, but also other environmental aspects such as biodiversity, infrastructure, land use, are to be considered in the future demand and intermodality modeling and planning, as well for policy modeling. So as well, time and cost aspects for different modes are to be considered to make these modes able to offer similar connectivity. It's just an example, because it was mentioned in the forthgoing presentation. The shift the proposed shift from plane to high-speed rail. There is a considerative time aspect to be looked at, and the Eurocontrol EU special report from 2018, for example, has estimated the completion time of a high-speed rail route to be roughly 26 years. So by then, and having this achieved on a global scale as well, because we have talked about Europe, but this is not the same for the global scale. Aviation will have significantly reduced its environmental footprint on those same routes, for example. So at Airbus, we are really focusing on providing the right technologies so that the society's demand and need for connectivity and future connectivity can be met but in a sustainable manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simone. It's great to hear from what Airbus is doing to meet their decarbonization ambitions and all the innovation that's going on, and also some of the priorities and factors that you're looking at. You mentioned looking at time and cost, and looking beyond that at biodiversity and all these other impacts that that stem way beyond. So it is very much a big problem, and it's great to have you speaking on behalf of Airbus to see where the industry is going. So I think it is now time for us to close the poll and see what the audience would like to say in terms of decarbonizing this non-urban passenger sector. I'm just going to end the poll here and share the results. So again, as in the last session, we do not have a clear winner, but some of the more popular choices are decarbonization opportunities for non-urban passenger transport lie in demand management, reducing trip distances and shifting to less polluting modes. Followed very closely, that was at 25%, 22% is looking at alternative powertrains, electric, hybrid electric, etc. And even infrastructure developments and uptake of policies mandating blended fuels aren't too far behind. So I'll say demand management and alternative powertrains kind of won this this poll, but the one option that is lagging far behind is pricing mechanisms, which got 6% of the votes. So this is a kind of a mixed bag of results, which probably represents exactly what you mentioned, Simone, that there are a number of policies that we need and paths that we need to take. Perhaps I will come to you first, and then followed by Demetrius for some comments on these results. Simone?
Yes, that's very interesting, and somehow it would be interesting to know where these where the people are coming from that have participated to the poll, because demand management, of course, is something very which is looked at very much in particular in Europe and in the Western countries, of course. So we in Airbus, we don't believe that a forced demand management is the right thing to do, because we believe that people do want to travel. They need to travel. The economies need to exchange. And we do see actually the solutions rather in providing, as I mentioned earlier, the right technologies so that actually future generation can benefit from all the positive impacts of aviation, but in a sustainable way. It is clear that there needs to be decarbonization pushed forward, and the industry as well as Airbus, we have clear plans in place. So the ATAC report, for example, as well, needs to be mentioned in this discussion, because it has been shown that there is the possibility that aviation can grow in a sustainable manner with the right policies, with the right actions, with the right technology developments in place, and therefore, actually, to allow people to move and connect as they wish in a sustainable way is for us the main viewpoint. And it's also looking. It's also interesting to see that there's such a big discrepancy between demand management and pricing mechanism, because pricing mechanisms are part of demand management, but it's rather a market-based demand management. So it's interesting because they go together somehow, and there seems to be a very big gap in the poll answers. So interesting to see.
Thank you, Simone. Perhaps Demetrius, this is something that maybe you could touch on as well. So pricing mechanisms got the least number of votes. Perhaps that is something you'd like to touch on.
Thank you very much. I have to say, I wasn't expecting pricing mechanisms to be dead last, but it is. It does seem that people think about very much with how a measure would impact them. So if people are thinking that pricing mechanisms would increase the cost of flying, people are very averse to that. So this could be a possible explanation. Another reasoning could be that the complexity and the different parties involved in any sort of pricing mechanisms, if done universally, would be very complex. So that would be another reason for the low responses. I want to touch a bit on the demand management and the alternative powertrain options, which got the most votes. I mean, definitely demand management could be a solution, but the worry is that it is limited in distance, meaning it could have a big impact in what we call regional transport. It could have an impact, like when we're talking about people doing short trips, daily trips, over the weekend trips, things that are usually nearby. There could be efforts either from policymakers, other stakeholders, to try to reduce those trips or make them happen with more sustainable modes. But as Simone mentioned, it is important for long distance travel to exist because it connects people, it connects economies, and it facilitates the growth of the sector and the economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Demetrius. So I think that is it for our interactive discussion portion. I'd like to thank you, Simone, for joining us. It's been great to have you sharing your insights. And right now, I'd like to invite Luis Martinez, our lead.
They think that an aviation flying would have to have a minimum share of sustainable aviation fuel, or you could have soft nudges. You could make the cost of sustainable aviation fuel reduce either through economic support for companies making them, or with other incentives, making the cost of sustainable aviation fuel lower so that airliners would then take it.
Thank you, Demetrius. We appear to potentially be having some audio issues, so I hope in the background we're able to fix that quickly, and apologies if you're not hearing this. We also have a question about modal shift. This was mentioned in the presentation and by Simone's points. We're talking about a shift from air to rail. Do we expect big investments in rail now or into the 2040s, or do you believe that there's a lack of vision? Perhaps I will come to Luis with this question on investments in rail.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Maliti, for the question, and hi all. I would say that there is some plans that we internalize in the model, that the model predicts the growth on rail corridors, especially in high-speed rail or in ultra-high-speed like maglev or Hyperloop, if they potentially may happen in the future. We have internalized which are the plans that are already underway either in Europe or in Asia or in other regions of the world. But there are also others that we do a simplified cost-benefit analysis where they can become appealing as an alternative. These are already then included, and also they have one element that is in modal shift, but there is also an element of inducing demand also as part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. So we have a question on pricing mechanisms, and perhaps I will direct this to Vatsalya. Are pricing mechanisms designed to internalize external costs? Can you give us a bit more on the theory behind pricing mechanisms and why they might be important?
Of course, thank you, Maliti, for that question. Yes, indeed. So pricing mechanisms, carbon taxes, are basically meant to internalize the cost of emissions, the environmental and societal cost of emissions that these transport modes have. So putting a price on these high emission transport modes discourages, in a way, penalizes these high emission transport modes, and at the same time makes the cleaner alternatives that are already available more lucrative, more acceptable. So the whole idea behind pricing, carbon pricing, and applying taxes on these emissions is to discourage these modes which are highly emitting and encourage the alternatives that are already available. Thank you,
Vatsalya. I have a question on electric cars. Perhaps I will ask Demetrius to take a first stab at this. The question is asking about the fact that private cars or electric private cars have a rather low range at the moment, given their charging requirements. And given that this is one of the limits, we have a kind of a thought experiment here. Could we imagine that the train industry builds new types of high-speed trains that improves the capability to transport private electric cars in order to increase distance coverage? Is this something you would consider? Have you thought about this in the models?
Thank you very much for that question. I have to say this is rather something that we haven't thought. This is something that does occur currently in very specific corridors. For example, crossing the English Channel, you do have cars going on top of trains. Now, generally speaking, I would say that the range anxiety, as this is commonly referred, is something that should go away as the time progresses, because technology will develop and cars will have bigger range. But this is something that could also be countered by having high-speed charging stations at roads, at intercity roads, which would allow those electric vehicles to be recharged during the trip.
Thank you, Demetrius. We have, it appears that the sustainable aviation fuel question, the answer to that question was when there was an audio glitch that happened. So perhaps, Demetrius, we could go back to the question on sustainable aviation fuels, and you could comment quickly, again, on the current trends and how we might be able to encourage more airlines to shift to these fuels.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll be very brief. I mentioned that in our recover scenario, which represents the current trajectory, fuel mandates go up to 15 to 25% in 2050, depending on the region. And that on the policies that you could use to encourage that, we have two types. We have hard nudges, which are fuel mandates, which mandate that airlines operating from a certain country would use certain share of sustainable aviation fuel. And then you have soft nudges, which would reduce the price or encourage the adoption of sustainable aviation fuel through various motivation, through various means in order to increase their adoption. Thank you.
Thank you, Demetrius, for repeating that answer. Before we end for this session, we have a few more minutes. I'd like to direct a question to Louise. This has come out of the summit in plenary panel that took place yesterday. ICAO discussed how during the pandemic, the aviation hub and spoke model has taken a significant hit. And some companies are deciding to redesign how their networks are built to adapt to these changes. Luis, could you comment perhaps on how this might influence cost of air travel, connectivity of air travel, and the resulting CO2 emissions?
Yes, thank you, Maliti, for the question. Of course, it will impact connectivity and also cost of air travel. I'll start by the end for your question regarding the travel distances and then the passenger kilometers. If we have a more origin to destination connection and less hub and spoke, we may have less passenger kilometers, and then we have in theory, we would have less emissions. Yet, if this directs as having lower load factors, this may even not compensate at all. I think this rebalance we have for regional travel, this may happen more direct travel and less indirect. For very long distance, the hub and spoke has proven us even to be more efficient because we cannot maintain really highly frequent connections with low demand to be competitive even from market prices, but also from an environmental perspective. Then it will be a readaptation of hub and spoke systems, I would say, at regional level and different from the global level, as it happened nowadays already with low-cost companies that they do not operate normally hub and spoke systems.
Thank you, Luis. I have a question for Vatsalya about, there's a comment, but I believe it leads very nicely into a question. We have a comment on why perhaps pricing mechanisms was not very popular in our poll. And one of the things that we need to be aware of is that when you put in place pricing mechanisms, it's not really necessarily going to help demand management unless there are alternatives in place that people can choose. So can you talk a little bit more, Vatsalya, about how these alternatives can come about, what policymakers can do with pairing pricing mechanisms with these other alternatives?
Thank you so much for the question, Mike. It's indeed a very important question and something that we must address. So as long as there are no alternatives, it is true that pricing mechanisms will not be popular. It's quite obvious why they won't be popular, because if you increase the price of using private vehicles and you don't provide people with alternatives, it's not going to be a popular choice indeed. So in order to make pricing mechanisms effective, I think it's very important to, at the same time, increase infrastructure for, say, electric vehicles, as Dimitris mentioned earlier and has been mentioned in several sessions before as well. Deploying charging infrastructure for rural areas, for regional travel is very important when we put pricing mechanisms in place so that people have the option of choosing the cleaner alternatives and have the, in order to, say, mitigate range anxiety, which is one of the reasons why these areas have low uptake of electric vehicles. Apart from that, I think it's also important to mention that pricing mechanisms are often unfairly, harmful to vulnerable groups. So that's something that must be kept in mind when these pricing mechanisms are designed or pricing incentives are designed. So for example, when you put a carbon tax or an energy tax, they can be made revenue neutral and fair by recycling the revenue into labor subsidies or into other type of subsidies for cleaner alternatives. So that there are a lot of ways to design these pricing mechanisms, subsidies and incentives in a way that they are fair and just and do not have adverse distribution impacts. It's just a matter of designing them carefully so as to make sure that they are accepted and at the same time providing alternatives that help shift from highly emitting modes to cleaner modes.
Thank you, Vatsalia. I think that's a good spot for us to finish off today because we are out of time. Thank you very much for joining us for the non-urban passenger transport session of the Outlook launch. Thank you to Demetrius, Vatsalia, and Louise for your insights and your presentation. A very special thanks to Simone Rawa for joining us from Airbus. For more information on the Outlook, you are welcome to visit the exhibition stage at the ITF Summit, where you can download the executive summary for free in 9 different languages. Our ITF webpage also provides links to the publication, our modeling results, which are up on the OECD Stats database, and recordings of these sessions once those are available. If you would like to join us for the next session, our last session of the morning program on freight transport, please stick around. You can navigate to that session using the Back to Timeline link on the top left-hand corner. That's it from me. Thank you all. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the fourth session of our morning program for the ITF Transport Outlook launch. This session will focus on the future of freight transport. And for those of you who have just joined us, welcome. My name is Malithi Fernando. I am a co-author and the project manager for this edition of the Outlook. It's great to be here moderating this session. You will hear shortly from my colleague, Francisco Furtado, who will present the findings on the future of global freight transport. And we are delighted to later be joined by Susana Val, the director of Zaragoza Logistics Center. This will be part of an interactive discussion that you can participate in via the poll that is just being launched on the right-hand side. So please use the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen so you can submit your questions there, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. The poll question, as I mentioned, is just on that side as well. There's also a discussion box. You're welcome to chat with other participants and respond to what you're hearing in this box. It will not be moderated by ITF staff during the session, so please make sure your questions are in the Q&A box. Finally, if you're experiencing technical difficulties, please use the live support button on the top right-hand corner for assistance. That is it for housekeeping. Francisco, the floor is yours for your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Malithi. And good morning or good evening to all participants from around the world that join us now. I will jump right into some key numbers that come out of this chapter of the Outlook. And I would ask all of the viewers did you know that freight currently accounts for more than 40% of transport emissions. So around 40% of all of transport emissions are made by the movement of goods. Actually, in 2020, this last year, half of all transport emissions were made by freight transport. Of course, this happened because of the specific circumstances of the pandemic. As we know, personal mobility was highly restricted, while goods and supplies had to keep moving. So while there was a very intense fall in passenger activity, there was also a fall in freight activity, but to a much less degree. Although when you look at the long term, the share of freight emissions is going to be around the same as it is today, around the 40%. It might slightly increase. Now, despite of all of this, the freight sector historically has received much less policy attention than the passenger sector. And this can even be seen in some simple but important things like data collection from public authorities or the monitoring of the sector. Now, a bit as a result of the pandemic and the ensuing crisis, the fact is that there was an increased public awareness on the relevance of freight transport, of logistics. This came a bit to the forefront of people's minds during this period. And this increased public awareness is something that can be leveraged to also increase the policy intention and the policy focus on the decarbonization of the sector and even other policy areas. Another important number to bear in mind is that the overall majority of emissions from the freight sector actually come from road transport. And road, including the non-urban part of transport, but also including the urban logistics and the last mile. So, and as you can see here in the graph, this is actually going to slightly increase a long time as we move forward. So we have here a sector that, when we measure in ton kilometers, accounts for around 17% of activity, but it is responsible for around 2/3 of emissions. Now, this highlights the importance of increasing the attractiveness of multimodal solutions that employ modes that are less carbon intensive than road. But the fact is there are limits to what can be done through multimodality, and road transport has specific characteristics, namely its flexibility, accessibility throughout the entire territory, that will always make it a key component of freight transport. And so, I mean, road transport and the decarbonization of road transport itself, it is a critical aspect if we indeed want to achieve a clean transition in freight transport. A last number to highlight, it's the fact that if we simply return to normal, if we keep the current ambitions and the current trajectory, we are not going to reach the climate goals. We are not going to reach the targets. Actually, there's going to be an increase in emissions by 2015. Now, it is possible with ambitious policies to decrease emissions compared to 2015 by 64%. And if on top of these ambitious policies, we also leverage some of the trends coming out of the crisis, we can actually achieve a 72% cut in emissions by 2015. And what is behind this cut, these differences? Well, the first thing, it's a very sharp increase in efficiency and a move across all transport modes, a move towards clean energy sources. This is the first factor explaining these results. A second factor to mention is the decrease in demand for fossil fuels. Fossil fuels nowadays represent 30% of international transport activity. And most freight transport activity measured in TKMs is international. And 30% of that is fossil fuels. If we move towards a decarbonized future, there will be less fossil fuels. The demand growth will slow down in general for freight. A last aspect is that an increased focus on resilience, on the diversification of supply chains, trade regionalization will also contribute a bit to this slowdown in demand growth. And these three factors will explain then how we can achieve this substantial cut in emissions. So what are the main takeaways, some policy insights to bear in mind and that are mentioned in the freight chapter of the outlook? Well, the first thing is that we have to scale up measures that are already available and actually already deployed. There are measures, namely that increase the efficiency in freight transport, that are already applied in some parts of the world, but they are not present in other regions of the world. There's also some types of measures that are done by large companies. For instance, eco-driving is rather common in Europe for large companies, but are not applied to small companies. And for instance, when you think about road freight, the majority of the market is dominated by these small companies. So the first thing is to apply across the board in all regions of the world and for all agents that are involved in freight transport and logistics, measures that already exist that increase the efficiency of freight transport. And a specific case of this happens in urban transport, in urban logistics. And in urban logistics, we already have available low and zero tailpipe emission solutions for light commercial vehicles. These solutions already exist. They're already commercially attractive. So they should be deployed and mainstreamed to the utmost. And another thing also to take advantage of is the voluntary programs that associate the carriers, the private companies that dominate freight transport. And these voluntary programs are privileged platforms to disseminate best practices and also for the company to incentivize and motivate the companies themselves to implement these best practices. And in addition to this, we have to boost cooperation. There has to be increased cooperation between the private companies themselves in freight transport, in logistics, in order to increase the use of currently available capacity and decrease empty running. trucks and other vehicles running empty and empty return trips. And cooperation is one of the ways to achieve that. And by using the available capacity to the most, and by reducing the empty return trips, what we are doing is that we are decreasing the use of fuel, reducing fuel consumption, we are decreasing costs, we are increasing efficiency, and we are reducing emissions. Now, another critical aspect, this has been already discussed in the previous sections actually, has to do with the alignment of price incentives with the freight and with transport decarbonization ambitions. So, I mean, few carriers will adopt lower zero emission vehicles or fuels if they cost more than the conventional fuels. But generally, nowadays, the negative externalities that are produced by the use of fossil fuels are not included in the price of these fuels. Quite the opposite. Actually, there are tax exemptions for fossil fuels, namely for maritime shipping, for aviation, but not only. So a first thing to do is to phase out these tax exemptions for fossil fuels and to start including in the prices of fossil fuels the cost of these negative externalities. But, and this is extremely important, not very addressed in the previous sessions, but extremely important, we have to ensure there is a fair share of costs and benefits that come out of this transition. And people have to perceive this. If we are increasing the costs and increasing taxes, people have to perceive this as being fair. And this has to be perceived, like I said, people between different sectors of economic activity, between different social sectors, and also between different regions of the world. For instance, this carbon pricing can be introduced not as a per se measure, as a single isolated measure, but can be introduced inside the wider tax reform package, where the increase in costs in some taxes will be offset by decreases in others. And when we look at different regions across the world, we have to bear in mind that nowadays, the OECD countries, the surface emissions per capita of OECD countries are 4 times higher than in non-OECD countries. And also that the effects of carbon pricing in freight transport and also slow steaming, for instance, can fall disproportionately in the regions that are furthest from the main production and consumption centers. So this issue of equity and the fair share of costs and benefits has definitely to be taken into account. Another critical, and this is the last slide and very relevant to bear in mind, is that nowadays, when we look at non-urban freight transport, long distance, heavier loads, only rail actually as a mature, consolidated, and relatively widespread solution that ensures zero emissions transport, tailpipe always. And particularly if you look at the heavy, long-haul, heavy-duty trucking, there is no short-term perspective. I mean, in the short term, there's no short-term perspective of having a widespread zero carbon solution. And the same can be said, for instance, for aviation. But indeed, if we want to reach the climate targets, it's absolutely decisive that we do make a transition to lower zero carbon energy sources across all transport modes. And to do that, I already mentioned aligning the price incentives. Another important factor is also standardization and having standards for the these new technologies, which is very important both on the vehicle side and in the infrastructure side. And this is very important to scale up these new technologies and also to make them more attractive for the end users and more easy to use. So this is also another critical element. And I'll finish by also mentioning here of course, I mean, this has to be mentioned, the stimulus packages. And the stimulus packages used to foster the economic recovery post-pandemic or when we enter in this new normal. And these stimulus packages play here an absolutely critical role. We live in a time of crisis. We are living in a time of crisis, but this is also a time of great opportunity. And the decisions we take today will shape the future to come for decades. And these stimulus packages, they can include investments into research for these new technologies, into the production and in distribution infrastructure for the alternative fuels, for these low and zero carbon fuels. They can also include investments into increased attractiveness of multimodal solutions, and particularly for emerging economies, this is a critical element, particularly for emerging economies, which is the renewal of the vehicle fleets, namely the road freight, but not only on road, but the renewal of the vehicle fleets, which is here a critical aspect to achieve this transition to a clean transport. Well, thank you very much for your time. Back to you, Meliti.
Thank you, Francisco, for highlighting the importance of freight policy in when we think about transport decarbonization. I now have the pleasure of introducing Susanna Val, Director of the Zaragoza Logistics Center. She will be joining us to kick off our interactive discussion, talking about the need for action and also bringing some practical examples of what's already being done in the sector. Susanna, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for sharing this launch time with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maliti, for your introduction. It's for me a pleasure being here today in this ITF 2021 panel. Thank you, Francisco, for your wonderful presentation about the ITF Transport Outlook 2021 as well. So I can't agree more with your words. I think we need an action plan on freight transport, and we need to consider this plan in the short, medium, and long term for sure. We can't forget that limiting the global warming by 1.5 Celsius require transport to be almost zero emissions or zero emissions by 2050. So that means that this transition to zero emissions, as you said, this cut in 72% on emissions in the next 20 or 30 years, that implies a radical revision of the whole transport system. We need to reverse the emissions trend in the last decades. Let me add that the objectives that are imposed by Kyoto Protocol are really difficult to meet. And to do this, data and information that must be provided that is provided in your document becomes extremely important and relevant at the time of implementing those effective plans. We know that freight transport mainly or has a direct correlation with the demand. As you mentioned as well, the demand is expected to grow between the current 2021 and 2050, given the current trend. Doesn't matter the scenario, we know for sure that it's going to increase, whatever happens. So the scenario is very uncertain. We have an economic crisis. We also are immersed in the pandemic situation, and we have some rising tensions on trade. So forecasting is in freight transport is very uncertain, very hard to predict. And we also have been involved in very opposite scenarios in which technology and globalization are for sure extended. So that could be the worst scenario in which the demand of freight will increase substantially. But we also have very opposite scenarios where there is a back to the proximity world. So as you said, as you mentioned, we are facing very diverse supply chains. So that would be the best scenario in which globalization will be refused somehow. So I would like to remark the fact that decarbonization requires specific and very quick actions that need to be scaled up. So there are many short-term solutions already in practice. So for instance, we have many activities put in practice in road. You said increase load factors, improving vehicle routing, eco-driving platooning, transferring freight to lower emissions transport mode or electric transport modes. There are some examples that are willing to mitigate externalities and of the emissions produced by transport. It's worthwhile to mention the role of urban areas. These are one of the biggest concerns related to decarbonization. So in 2050, it's expected that more than 80% of the population will live in urban areas. Some measures are already put in practice, but most of them in a European level or in developed countries. But for those emerging countries or regions, that are an illusion right now. So some solutions already in practice are zero emission zones, autonomous vehicles, drones are being testing in some European cities as well. And of course, there are a lot of projects currently ongoing in the field of circular economy for the decarbonization of the sector, improving resource efficiency as well. I would like to emphasize as well that policies can help to reduce emissions, but we can't rely only on policies for the entire process of decarbonization. So if we want to achieve these net zero emissions by 2050, all transport vehicles from from cars to airplanes, etc., they need to run to zero emissions energy in the future, in the short future. So in general terms, the full decarbonization requires a shift to new technologies and energy carriers as well. We need renewable, decarbonized electricity is fundamental for sure. And I must have to say that hydrogen or fuel cell trucks could offer also an alternative or complementary pathway to zero emissions. So of course, definitely the decarbonizing the entire transport require different pathways according to each transport mode. And of course, they have very different implications to the overall energy system. So for instance, in shipping, countries are currently attempting to regulate maritime emissions through the International Maritime Organization, which is really far from decarbonization right now. So the same is happening with the air transport mode as well. So some generic and drastic solutions must be implemented in the next years or in the next decades to fulfill the decarbonization target by in transport by 2050. So pricing greenhouse gases, international cooperation, adopting new technologies and promotion of renewable fuels should be a priority as well. I've been involved in many or several European projects, as this is my field of expertise. I've been involved in several examples of initiatives that are currently in use. So for instance, I had the pleasure to participate in a European project called LEARN, in which we participated in the definition of the GLEC, the Global Logistics Emission Council Framework, which is a methodology based on protocols and international standards that contribute to fill the gap of the existing life cycle product for logistics, warehousing, and transportation. And within this framework, we aim to create a worldwide network of companies willing to adopt this methodology in the process of emissions, accounting, and decarbonization, of course. So I would like to emphasize that this concept of decarbonization is new or even unknown for several companies that are used to externalize their transport to third parties or to other logistics operators. So there is a long path also on education and training to achieve this mental shift by the company, in the company side, I mean. I've been also involved in some other examples of European projects focused on sustainable policies response to urban mobility transition. This is a project that we are right now facing. It's called Sprout. Or the electrification in large urban areas in developing and emerging economies is Solutions Plus, that would be transferring somehow solutions or successful solutions at European cities to other emerging countries. We are also researching how to decrease emissions with digital twins, which is a simulation tool that has been tested for the first time in urban areas in the project called LEAD. Or we are researching solutions towards decarbonization in logistics, climate neutrality, and digital transformation of supply chains, which is called, the project is called Boost Block, and has started recently at European level. So to conclude, I would like to state that there is a long path to fulfill the process of decarbonization. There is an uncertain trend given the economic and international trade unstable, and the solutions require the collaboration among all the stakeholders in the supply chain. But last but not least, there are several challenges, of course, affecting the deployment. So there is a lack of policy action, or there is not almost policy action, and the technological progress, although it's high, but it's not so high. It's following a slow pace to fulfill the 2050 target. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susanna. You've given us a lot to think about with all the examples of what's already being done and the fact that we are still not there. Thank you very much. So now I would like to hear from the audience via our poll. I'm going to end the poll right now and give a chance for Susanna and Francisco to comment on what our audience members have to say about decarbonizing the freight transport sector. Well, as with before, we don't have a very, runaway winner, but the two top choices are to, with 25% of the votes, support technological development in clean energy sources, both vehicles and infrastructure. And with 23% of the votes, aligning price incentives with freight decarbonization ambitions, such as phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, carbon taxes, distance charges, etc. We don't have a clear, least popular option. The rest kind of are in the 12 to 14% vote region. So Susanna, perhaps I'll give the floor to you for a quick minute to comment on some of these findings.
Okay, for me it's very interesting that there is 25% related to support technological development. It's very interesting for me. Let me add that the energy production and consumption accounts for 75% of the greenhouse gases emissions. So I think that that solution supporting technological development for the development of clean energy sources that could lead to new investments, jobs growth, of course, and contributing to the economic recovery. So I think that we can lead with this with the use of cleaner electricity produced by renewable sources, promotion of low carbon fuels, hydrogen, as I mentioned in my speech. And I think that it would be good for sectors that are really hard to decarbonize, such as heavy transport and some other industries, for instance. Aligning incentives is also interesting. I think it's inclusive and supports the economic development, and pricing could be applied to all greenhouse gases, although in practice it's only applied to carbon emissions. So I think both of them are the most interesting, because some other solutions are considered, from my point of view, are considered mostly short-term solutions. For instance, low-hanging fruits, of course, are solutions that may mitigate the externalities of freight transport, but there are no solutions for the medium or long term. So I think I would agree with the audience answer.
Thank you, Susanna. Francisco, do you have a brief addition to that?
Yes, thank you, Melissa, and thank you very much, Susanna. I just highlight that indeed, like was mentioned in the presentation, the transition to low to zero emissions fuels and vehicles with the required infrastructure is a critical part of achieving the overall decarbonization of freight transport. So I think it's no surprise that's number one. A bit more surprising, especially in contrast to the previous sessions. I don't know if the people that are viewing this session had the opportunity to view the previous ones, where carbon pricing was always like the least preferred option, while here is actually in the forefront. And I don't know if it's the way it was framed, which was a bit different, or if it's also the fact that it's not the citizens personally that are paying for this, it will be the companies paying for this. So this is kind of makes it easier, or it can be also the audience composed more by experts that are very keen in this type of measures.
Thank you, Francisco. Interesting indeed. We are now going to move away from the discussion and to the Q&A portion. So I would like to thank you again, Susana, for sharing your insights with us, and we'll welcome Luis Martinez to the stage for our Q&A portion. All right, we already have quite a few questions. So let me get started with a question for Francisco. There's a question here about, can we talk about the transportation of hydrogen? The question asks that, mentions that we're currently transporting hydrogen with fossil fuel powered means. And they're asking whether we can finally use clean hydrogen to transport hydrogen. What do you see as the role of hydrogen in freight transport?
Okay, I'll be honest about this. I have some, I think hydrogen will play a part, because especially for for instance, for long distance road freight, it's even technologically challenging to find the zero emission solutions. It's complicated to have batteries that allow for this type of transport, at least with current technology. There's some solutions like the direct supply of energy through electric road systems that can be used, but this also has some costs, infrastructure costs. So hydrogen is seen as a possible solution in this, for instance, for this sector. I would just put here a note of caution on hydrogen being a solution for everything, because actually the production of hydrogen is a very inefficient process. Producing hydrogen from clean energy is actually a process where you lose a lot of energy, It's around 20%, I believe, that you keep. So it is part of the solution, but I don't think it will be the only solution. And actually, one important thing to bear in mind, or two important things to bear in mind, is that in different regions of the world, different pathways and even energy vectors can be more appropriate for this energy transition. And also, while nowadays we have like one single energy source, fossil fuels, diesel or gasoline, basically, in the future, we'll have a mix of solutions for different regions, for different type of operations, for different distances, for different loads. There will be more of a mix of solutions than one single solution.
Thank you, Francisco. Perhaps a question for Louise on internalizing the costs of global freight transport, and internalizing the external costs. Can you comment on how we account for that within our models, perhaps?
Yes, thank you, Melody, for the question, and we have two ways of internalizing the costs. I don't go in too much detail now, but we have one thing is the production of how much freight is moved from A to B, that already it's impacted by the cost of transport. If you change the costs by internalizing part of the externalities, you may vary this cost, and then you may even transport less freight. But also the internalization of the costs has impact on the mode split, on how the connection between A and B is produced in the shares that are done by sea, by rail, by road, or by air. Depends and waterways. It depends, of course, in the availability of solutions between the pairs of around the world. But I would say that is through these two elements, on the conversion of trade into freight volumes and in the mode split.
And perhaps, Louise, I'll stay with you for one more question. In the previous sessions, we've talked a lot about accessibility and the need to think on kind of a local development level to reduce transport demand. Can you speak a bit more on how we include that in the freight transport sector, and how it might apply specifically for goods as opposed to people?
Yes, we introduced in one of our scenarios mainly the ability of logistic chains to be more regionalized, and that the long distances would reduce with time. We see that the forecast that we had for trade by default with globalization, the average distances of trade are increasing over time and has been increasing in the last decades. And what we test in this scenario, it was reshape the patterns between the costs of the different regions and within the region to try to see what would be the ability of having supply chains more reliant on regions, on their own region. And what happened with this is that we have the average distances decreasingly significantly. This would be as an additional cost, but is an internalized cost, but not an explicit cost of having this across regions within the model.
Thank you, Louise. We have a question, Francisco, that perhaps you could answer on how, well, with the industry being so fragmented, the freight industry, and the profit margins being small, how do you introduce incentives for businesses to collaborate and increase the efficiency of last mile delivery and reduce empty running?
Well, this is actually something that, because there's other measures that have initial costs that are financial costs that are high. And for instance, I talked about fleet renewal, and in this case, the stimulus packages and direct public incentives, because the public side, although this is a privately dominated sector, for this transition, the public sector will also have a critical role. On this issue of boosting cooperation, it's different because it's not so much a cost issue. Actually, this would decrease costs. It's more a question of attitude. And it's also a question, and we mentioned this in some of our reports, I don't know if they're being shared in the discussion forum, but it's also a question, there's actually some legal barriers, you know, to cooperation between private companies, antitrust laws, and they exist for a reason, of course, to prevent monopolies. But there are solutions like trusted third-party platforms that are being tested already by the industry, and that actually had a bit of uptake during the crisis, for instance, to reduce empty running. And that can be a solution and a promising way to achieve that, to achieve this cooperation. And other than indirect measures too, for instance, if you apply distance charges, this might also foster the sector to be a bit more rational and to decrease the vehicle kilometers and to foster consolidation of loads.
Thank you, Francisco. We have 1 minute left, so I'll ask for a quick input from Louise, perhaps, on what about the carbon generated in the production of vehicles and of energy? And it seems that perhaps the solutions that we are speaking about is a displacement of the source of carbon emissions and not necessarily a cut in total emissions. Francisco, Louise,
yes,
would you like to jump?
Yes, part of the solution on the as Francisco also mentioned, it also will depend on the grid quality that we have on the electricity production. Because if we are transporting our transport emissions to the other sectors, then we are not solving the problem. We are just transferring the problem. But if we get our responsibility, which is within the transport, and knowing that also the electric will also do it, so I think that this is something that we need to do in the short term also to increase and have affordable solutions that will allow decarbonization.
Thank you, Louise. Francisco, I saw you nodding there. So would you like to add something to the end?
Yeah, just one note, because I think this is a very interesting question. And this is actually a novelty of this edition of the Outlook, because before we didn't consider this. We always consider only the tailpipe direct transport emissions. But in this Outlook, it's not the focus, but we do include an assessment of the well-to-wheel emissions. And if you see in the freight chapter, there's a graph, and this is a teaser to read the chapter, because the chapter has and the entire Outlook has a wealth of information we cannot summarize in a short session like this. But if you go there, you will see there is a graph and there's a discussion exactly on how this will evolve. And indeed, there is a bit a movement of emissions further upstream. So the decrease in well-to-wheel is not so big as the tank-to-wheel, but it's still significant. You know, like just to give you an idea, it's 72% in the Reshape Plus, the tank-to-wheel, and the well-to-wheel is like 62%. So there is indeed a bit of moving upstream, but in general, there is still a huge decrease, even if you consider the well-to-wheel.
Thank you, Francisco. And that is all the time we have for today. As Francisco mentioned, there's lots more in our publication than what we've been able to cover in these quick sessions. We hope that you've enjoyed staying with us, whether you joined us from the very beginning or just for this freight in-depth look. I would like to thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to Francisco, Louise, and a very special thank you to Susanna Val for sharing her insights during this session. For more information on the Outlook, you can download the executive summary for free on the ITF Summit platform. It's available in 9 different languages. Also, our website Outlook page has links to our results, links to the publication itself, and there will be recordings of these sessions when they are available. The final session this is the final session for the morning program, and we will be repeating all these sessions in the afternoon with a brand new panel of guests for time zones further west. Please join us if you missed some of the previous sessions. And before that, we do have a high-level panel that starts in half an hour. It's titled Advice to Action, Transitioning to Sustainable, Equitable Mobility. We hope to see you there. Thank you very much.